All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday of week 9. Also, incidentally, International Women's Day. I'm not wearing any purple today, even though Sir Linda sort of asked us all to wear purple, but I don't own any purple, so dark blue is the best I can do. But I still support women internationally. No purple? No purple?
Nothing.
You have nothing in purple? That's okay. For International Women's Day, you're supposed to wear purple, but I don't have any purple. Okay, so let's say good morning to some people who are here, and then we'll dive in. So Nicole is here. Good morning, Nicole. Cheyenne is here. Good morning. Shania is here. Good morning, Shania. And Sarah's here. Good morning, Sarah. Okay, so, oh yes, on Friday, we had just started to talk about racism, and I think we kind of had an interesting conversation because even though many of us are familiar with racism, I think we had trouble kind of actually quantifying or explaining what race was, and I think that's not surprising. I think there's a lot of confusion about race and racism in greater society, and I think it's very normal for people to think they understand something until you ask the question, well, what is it anyway? And then you kind of realize, oh, I think I have some gaps in my knowledge, right? And I think we kind of saw that on Friday. And so I asked you a few kind of questions about what race is and what race were you and did you know, and who got to say what race you are, could it change, does it mean anything? And we had some interesting answers, but sorry, I'll just skip through that. The first thing we did, if you remember on Friday, was that we defined what race actually was. And so we said that race was a social construction, and a lot of times there are elements of biology and evolution and things kind of tied up in the idea of race, but really what we're talking about here is race as something that humans have created, right? An artificial category into which we place people based on how they look, right? Based on their color of their skin, the shape of their eyes, how their hair grows, the shape of their face, all kinds of their nose, all kinds of physical characteristics that people use to categorize people. That's what we call race. And so I said that was race, and we said that ethnicity was something a little bit different, right? Ethnicity had to do with your cultural background, the sort of story and the feeling of your people, whoever your people are. That has to do that's ethnicity, right? That's not race. Again, sometimes race and ethnicity overlap quite a bit, sometimes less so, right? So these are kind of two different concepts. We said that even though when we talk about race, we often have ideas about how much biology we're actually talking about, we said that humans are, that seems low actually. Good morning, Scotty. That seems low. I'm not sure if that's a proper number, but basically humans have many genes strung out over 23 chromosomes, and those genes code for everything that we are, everything the way our body works. But what I was trying to convince you of on Friday, and I guess I shouldn't have to convince you because this is actually factual science, human beings are not really that genetically variable. We've been interbreeding for quite some time. Good morning. We've been interbreeding as a species for quite some time. Our genes have been getting mixed together for quite some time. And so we don't really have any biological races, or we don't have anything of what a biologist would call a race. We do have certain genes that are adaptations to the environment. And so I mentioned here my skin color is an adaptation to an environment that is cloudy and not very sunny, right? And so in order to properly synthesize vitamin D, my ancestors needed skin that was kind of transparent, right? If your ancestors come from closer to the equator, you'll find that skin is darker because you need to protect from the sun. Getting those rays of sunlight into your skin is not that much of an issue, right? So some of the things that we kind of classify as race are really environmental adaptations, and they don't really, but if you look at the genes, they don't really make a lot of difference. And so a human who sort of understands its world through its eyes sees skin color as a rather significant difference between people, right? It seems like a big difference. But again, if you look at the genes, if you look at the genetics, you're talking about just a couple of genes that code for skin color, and it doesn't really, it's just not a big difference between humans. Basically, human beings are the same, and they're very genetically similar, even more so than many other animals. And so yeah, to the point where sometimes there is more genetic variability within a race than between races. And so there's evidence of that as well. So again, there is a biological component. I mean, we all, our skin color and how we appear is all about biology for the most part. But the biological differences that create those changes are just not significant, really. We're basically all the same person, genetically speaking. But even though, sorry, it's Monday morning and it's hard to sort of get your train of thought rolling. How was everyone's weekend? Fun? Boring? Give you 2 days off and it was boring?
I mean, like, basically the same thing as every other weekend. But it's not really much to say about it.
Weather was kind of weird, right? It was sunny, then it was raining, then it was hailing out in Coquitlam, and sunny later on.
Actually, a question about this.
Sure.
So, if race doesn't matter, then race is only a slight difference in genetics, but so is gender, then why do we classify them different?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that's what we'll answer today. So, yeah, I'm suggesting here that, in biological terms, in purely biological terms, race does not exist, not in humans anyway. As I say, we're basically all the same. We have some genetic differences linked to our environment and where on the planet our genes actually come from, but they're just not that significant of a difference. But that said, we've said that race is not a biological difference, but it's a social construction, right? And we know that social constructions, things that people believe in society, have a lot of power, right? It doesn't really matter if they're true or not. If people believe them, they have power. And so race is one of these things where even if it's not biologically real, it is socially real. It's a thing that people, it's a difference that people think is meaningful, and therefore they will act on that belief. And so it does have consequences.
And then, like, sex, like, male and female are different, but not that different, so it's not a racist environment.
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, but so you're saying that the genders are more similar than.
I mean, like, race is only the slight genetic differences.
Right.
But what about gender?
Well, is that a bigger genetic difference?
Yeah, I mean, like, if it's as slight as the difference between race do we say sex is real?
Why do we say sex is?
If we say race is not real, it's not biologically real, then why do we say sex is biologically real?
Ah, well, I think there's some. I think you do see genetic and physiological differences between men and women. I mean, it's, you know, the probably the most obvious one is that we actually have different chromosomes, right? If you're, for the most part, there's some variance, but for the most part, if you're a woman, you have two X chromosomes, and if you are a male, you have two Ys, and so that causes your body to grow differently, causes your brain to wire differently. Obviously, women have the capacity to have children, and men don't. And so I think there is kind of an intuitive biological difference between men and women. The question might be, you know, how great is that difference? Because I think one of the things we talked about in sexism was that every society has gender roles, every society has norms, and it tries to teach and enforce those roles and norms. And so the question is how much is biological and how much is cultural, right? How much of the difference between men and women is due to their genetics and biology, and how much do we actually teach men how to be men and women how to be women? That's the tricky question. And again, because so much of what humans do is cultural, in some cases it becomes very difficult to pull apart why people are doing what they're doing, because once they kind of internalize their programming, their culture and their socialization, it feels natural, right? It feels very natural to do the things that your culture has taught you to do, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily natural. Is that helping? You suppose? I'm going to take that as a no. It's yeah, I think that I don't know. Like the thing is that it's kind of hard to divide these things out, and I suppose if you did a full tally of the human genome, you could figure these things out. But you know, really, there's nothing on the planet that's more like a human female than a human male, right? There's no thing that's more similar. And again, if you look at humans of different races, you'll see that there's not really a significant amount of variation there either. I mean, if we share 99% of our DNA with bonobos, and we share 99.8 with our closest extinct relative Neanderthals. If we take that into account, then you know the differences between any human is less than 0.1%, probably far less than that. So it's just there's really most of the difference that we see and feel is social, right? And again, there's some pretty obvious biological differences between men and women, but I mean, we're really not that different creatures, and I think we manufacture a lot more difference than really exists. But culture is a different thing, right? Cultures can, because humans are biologically what they are. You can't really change that too much, but culture can be anything, right? Anything that people can dream up and agree to, culture can be. And so that's, I think, where people differ more in terms of the culture that they grow up in and experience. That's where we have kind of real difference. But even then, if you study culture, if you take anthropology, you'll see that human cultures often work in very kind of predictable ways, right? There are ways in which humans like to do things. And so again, even if the details are different and the environment is different, the way that culture operates is quite similar. Is that getting anywhere near what you want to know? Are you just saying yes so that I'll stop talking? Okay. right. So, where were we here? Right. So again, even if race is not biologically real, things that good morning, things that things that people believe have power, right? And they affect people's lives in society. So here I'll just throw this. We've talked about this term before, or we've mentioned this term before, but I'm just going to mention it again. We often kind of classify racism and oppression in North America as being between white people, the dominant group, and people of color, which is kind of the non-dominant group. And those basically, people of color includes basically anyone who's not white, okay? This is not an ideal classification because you're kind of putting a lot of people in the same basket, right? You're putting people, if you think of the US, if you're talking about Black Americans, you're talking about Black Americans who have been in the country for hundreds of years and maybe their ancestors were slaves. You have Black Africans who have more recently come to the United States. You have people who have come from the Caribbean. You have indigenous people. You have people who have come from Southeast Asia and South Asia and India. You have Japanese people. You have Mexican people coming over you have all kinds of different cultures and ethnicities and experiences that are being kind of lumped into one category, peoples of color. So people of color is not really a great categorization because it takes so many different people and experiences and makes them kind of the same. But we're still going to use the term for convenience sake. But I just wanted to point out the fact that not everyone in that group is having the same experience. Not everyone in that group experiences the same kind of discrimination or oppression as others. Okay? Just add that in. So, yeah, I have an article for you to read. And it talks about a few of the things that we've already talked about. It gives us some more data surrounding the biology of race. But it's also going to talk a little bit about how race is constructed in the United States. And so we said that if race is a social construction, and I think this might lead into your question a little bit as well, Mulder, but if race is a social construction, then why was it constructed, right? Why have humans created this thing? What is the purpose of it? And so this article will start to introduce that, and then we can talk a little bit about how race is constructed in the United States, and then we can talk about how race is constructed here in Canada, but one thing at a time. So I have the article for you to read. It's in Microsoft Teams, of course. I have some questions for you to answer. Ooh, there's 10 of them. And let me just make sure. Systemic. Yeah, okay. So I'll give you some time to read this article, then we'll answer the questions, and then I think we'll have a better understanding of race and race in the United States and Canada anyway, before we dig deeper. So, okay, let's read. Okay, people. I know this is a bit of a long one, and so maybe it's a good time to take a break now, refocus our heads, and then when we come back, we'll have a few more minutes to just finish reading, and then we'll talk about the questions. Okay, so take a quick break, and then we'll come back. Okay, people, and we're back. I'm just going to put just a few more minutes on the clock here so we can finish reading this, and then good morning. And then we'll talk about. I know there's a lot in this article. There's a lot of questions, and so just take a few more minutes, finish up, and then we'll discuss. Okay. Okay, let's talk about this one. I wanted you to read this article because, it's a little on the long side, but I wanted you to read it because A, there's a lot of good information in here. Number two, it's going to set up a couple things that we'll talk about. Number three, it actually does a really good job of citing its sources. And a lot of the articles that we read in this course are kind of a little more kind of newspapery, kind of opinion pieces, and so they don't often cite their sources in the text. But this one does a really good job of showing you how to do that, right? Not in the citation, but kind of how they treat things. And so, how they kind of paraphrase ideas, how they mention that, certain authors have talked about certain things, and then how they handle quoted material as well. And so I think this article does a good job of doing all three of those things, of citing things well in the text, either by mentioning what other people have said, or by paraphrasing them, or by quoting them directly. And as you saw, this article does all three. I think it does a really good job. And so if you were looking for a good example of how to do that in your writing, I would look to this paper to see how they do it, because they do a reasonably good job, I would say. Okay. Question number one. So when and why does race as a category of identity emerge? When is race constructed? When? Probably a little bit earlier than that. Yeah, it's connected to the colonization of North America and to other parts of the world by European countries. Forgot the year. When do European nations start colonizing other places? 15? Yeah, probably the very earliest, right? We have Columbus discovering the New World in 1492. So yeah, probably at the very earliest, maybe in the 1500s, and then as we get into the 16 and the 1700s, things start to increase, right? You've got more and more colonial activity happening. So that's kind of the when, but what's the why? One word cannot be an explanation. You're not entirely wrong, but one word cannot be an explanation. Is it because of colonization that Europeans start to see people of different colors for the first time? Yeah, I would kind of expect that. I would expect not. I mean, at the very least, people had been trading with different parts of the world for hundreds or thousands of years, and it's not as if in 15 or 1600 Europeans discovered, oh, there's black people living in the world. We didn't know. They knew, right? So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a discovery thing. They do start, yeah, so scientists do start to explore the differences between races, but there's kind of a reason why they start doing that. It's not, maybe it's scientific curiosity, but it's a little more than that as well. You might have to read between the lines on this, but I think they're pretty clear about what they say. Yeah, what does that mean in your own words? Yeah. Yeah, if you're going to travel to another country and enslave the population and take their resources, then you kind of need some sort of justification for that, do you not? You need to somehow feel that that is an okay thing. Why is that an okay thing? Why is it an okay thing to go to someone else's country and take all their stuff and enslave their population? In what universe is that okay? It's only okay if you create an ideology that says, well, these people are not as sophisticated or intelligent or moral or whatever as we Europeans are, right? That's what allows them to do this, right? Yeah, so that this idea of superiority comes from colonization, right? And so why are you taking over this country in Africa or India or North America? Why are you taking this over? Well, either these people are uncivilized barbarians and we have to bring civilization to this land, or we can think of them as almost like childlike, right? Oh, these Indians, North American Indians, they're so unsophisticated, we'll have to teach them culture, right? We'll have to teach them how to be civilized because, of course, us in Europe, we are the most civilized people. All of this is in quotes, by the way. We are the most civilized people, and we have to, it's our burden to teach all of these other places of the world how to be civilized, right? So this sort of hierarchy of races gets created to justify one group's treatment of everyone else, right? And so you see in the process, some scientists start getting involved. They start suggesting subspecies of humans, right? Europaeus and Asiaticus and Americanus, no such thing, but they start suggesting it anyway. People, I'll show you in a minute, people start measuring human skulls and, looking at the inside of human skulls. They think they can tell things about what certain races are like. Can't do that, but early scientists think that they can do it. So yeah, it has to do, it goes hand in hand with colonization, and it has to do with a justification to exploit certain groups of people. How can you make it okay to go into another country and take their things? Well, they must not be worthy of respect, right? They must be somehow less than us. We must somehow dehumanize them, right? And that's exactly what happens. And so prior to colonization, race is not a thing. Race is not something that anyone really cares too much about. But it becomes a thing to justify this colonial process. Number two, there's a kind of an official ideology of race. So what is a belief in a belief that race is a real thing? What are those ideas? What are those ideas? What is the ideology of race? I think there's a few pieces to this. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 if I'm correct. Well, actually that might overlap a little bit with number 4, but give me what you got. What is this ideology of race? It involves, it involves, say that one more time?
Beliefs about racial inequality.
Okay, it has to do with racial inequality, okay. Okay, what else?
Racial categories are exclusive.
Yeah, that's part of it, right? So part of it is that racial categories are exclusive, right? And so what does that kind of mean to you, Nicholas? Yeah, there's something about, yeah, once you are one race, that's what you are, right? You're born into it. You can't change. You can't be half and half. You can't, right? So racial groups are mutually exclusive, right? You're either black or you're white or you're Asian or you're North American Indian, right? But somehow you can't be both at the same time, right? So there's this idea that to belong to one race is to be separate from other races, right? That's that exclusivity part. To be one means you're not part of the other. What else is there? Other pieces here.
Some races are naturally inferior.
Right. There's a belief that some races are inferior and some are superior, right? So not only are these racial groups different and separate, but some are superior and some are inferior. Again, there's no truth to this at all, but that's the ideology of race, right? What else is there? Right. There's the idea that somehow race and culture are the same thing, right? So somehow races and cultures are connected. What else is there? So racial groups are exclusive. There's superior races and inferior races. Somehow culture is inseparable from race, apparently, is what the ideology of race is talking about. I think there might be one more piece to this as well. Yeah, the idea that race is based on biology, I guess that underpins all of this as well. I think that's probably the last piece, right? So the idea that race should be written into your country's legal framework, right? So somehow races should be differentiated within the legal code of the country, right? That's kind of the ideology of race, and it's kind of what race-based societies believe. But of course, hopefully we already know that most of these are false, right? Racial differences originate in biology. Yes, they do, right? In terms of the skin colors and physiological differences that we identify as race are genetic, right? But are they meaningfully different? Do they make a difference? Not really, right? Humans are mostly the same. The second one, each race has a distinct culture. Do you think that's true? I don't know how to describe whatever it is to be culturally Chinese, okay? But let's imagine for a minute what that is, right? To be sort of culturally Chinese. If my girlfriend and I go and we adopt a baby from China, tiny little Chinese baby just born, bring this little Chinese baby back here and raise this child as our own here in Canada, will that kid be walking around acting culturally Chinese and speaking Mandarin? No, that's ridiculous, right? This kid is going to grow up Canadian. They're going to look Chinese because that's where their genes come from, but they're going to grow up in our family and they're going to be culturally Canadian and they're going to act as a Canadian does. Culture is not genetically encoded, right? Culture is transmitted socially, right? Culture is learned. And so race-based societies don't think that, right? Race-based societies think that somehow culture and biology are connected, but in fact, they are not. Culture is taught, right? Culture is learned. And so, yeah, our little Chinese baby will not will not grow up in any way Chinese. They will grow up Canadian in our family, right? Because that's the culture that we will teach them. Let's see. Yeah, racial differences are meaningful and unchangeable. They're not, right? They're racial differences are not biologically meaningful, but they are socially meaningful. And unchangeable, well, I'll show you a video in a little bit that suggests that, in fact, racial differentiations do change depending on political and social considerations. And so the race you are now might not be the race that you would have been 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Yeah, and again, racial categories should be written into political, legal, and social systems. Well, in Canada and the US, this is exactly what happened, right? And this is kind of the foundation of systemic racism, right? The idea that the country itself is structured in a way that advantages some people and disadvantages others based on their race, right? This is what systemic racism is all about. And again, that has happened in both the US and in Canada, right? If the US has some more dramatic examples, but schools in the United States used to be segregated, right? There were black schools and there were white schools. And if you were a black child, you didn't go to a white school. And if you were a white child, you didn't go to a black school, right? And that was legally enshrined. Do you think all of those schools were of equal quality? Do you think you got just as good of an education at a black school as you did at a white school? No, you did not, right? Is that still the case if you go to a school that is in a predominantly black neighborhood in the United States today? Will you get as good of an education as you would get at a predominantly white school? Depends on the neighborhood, but the odds will say probably not, right? Black schools are in black neighborhoods, and black neighborhoods tend to be poorer than white neighborhoods. And the neighborhood around a school is where the funding for that school comes from. And so if you go to a school in a low-income neighborhood, your school doesn't have the money and the resources that other schools do, right? And so, again, these things get written into the legal code, and then they start to have real effects on people's lives. And so again, even though race isn't biologically meaningful, when countries start to get organized on racial lines, they have a big impact on people's life and people's experience, right? Let me show you a few things. Let me show you a few slides. We'll come back to some of these questions, but let me just see here. Yeah, so one of the things this article has talked about is race as biology. So again, the genetic differences that we see according to race, quote unquote, are generally environmentally adaptive changes, but they don't define us as different, as any sort of different race or different population, right? We share some genes if we come from certain parts of the world, but it's not such a big difference, right? And so, sorry, we have talked about this already. Right. Yeah, so in North America here, we see race being used as a justification, right? And particularly if you look at the United States, the United States was created on, the principle of freedom and equality and justice for all, right? That's the slogan. But of course, that wasn't the case, right? Some people got freedom and equality and justice. Other people, not so much, right? And so again, a little bit awkward. How do you have a country where there's freedom and justice for all when in fact a large number of people are enslaved, right? How do you have both of those things existing at the same time? And again, for the Americans, they adopted this ideology of race, and of course this is in the 1700s, but in the 1700s they adopted this ideology of race, that they were in fact superior, and that's why things were the way they were, because they were somehow better, smarter, more powerful, more organized. And of course these people were, enslaved, but if they worked hard, then they wouldn't be in this enslaved condition, right? That was kind of the thinking. And again, the science of the time started to back up these prejudices as well, right? And again, this is something that we already saw, is that as the dominant group can enforce its prejudices on society. White people here are the dominant group. White people are also in charge of science at the time, because there are no black scientists at the time. And so they're able to enforce their prejudices on society. They're able to study race and come to their own conclusions, which they do. So here, in the article, they mentioned this guy, Johann Blumenbach. And so Blumenbach studied 60 human skulls. We talked about sample size. That's not nearly large enough to quantify all of humanity, right? There's how many million? There's 36, or 36. Right now there's 7.4 billion humans on the planet. Is 60 skulls enough to look at? No, it's a tiny little sample, right? Ridiculous. But anyway, he did it, measured them all, and thought that he could determine that there were 5 broad biological races of human, right? Caucasian, hello, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American, right? And so he did all these measurements, said that, these are all different types of human, and not only are they different types sort of biologically, but they had different characters to them. Guess which one was the best? White ones, right? White people were seen as the best. He also believed, shockingly, in this degenerative hypothesis. So here we have an odd mixture of science and religion, where Blumenbach thought that Adam and Eve, the first people that God created, were in fact Caucasians. They were white. But the different races came about because certain groups had degenerated. They had spent too much time in the sun, or maybe they hadn't eaten well enough or whatever. And he felt that if, people took better care of themselves, they could eventually transition back and become white. They could become the ideal person again, which is, horrifically racist, is in no way connected to any kind of science or reality that we know of. But again, this is something he believed, right? And I don't know, do you think this belief informed his science? Do you think it influenced the conclusions he came to? Probably did, right? So there's this thing of craniometry going on where, people thought they could measure skulls and kind of have some idea about what people were like. There was also this thing called phrenology, where psychologists thought if you looked at the inside of someone's skull, which is shaped partially by the brain, you could tell what people were like. And so you may have seen something like this. Have you ever seen any of these things? Sometimes they sell them at Winners as like home decor. You'll see people put them on their fireplace mantles and things. But what they are is the idea that you can actually determine what people are like by the shape of their brain, right? And so I can't really read this on my screen, but number 16, conscientiousness. You can tell how conscientious a person is. Or firmness, how kind of rigid and firm they are, or how secretive they are, number 7. If you look at all these different parts of the brain, you can read and you can tell what a person's personality is like. Ridiculous. There's what? How do you even do that? It's a pseudoscience. You just make it up, and then you pretend it's scientific. You can't do it. There's no such thing. You cannot look at the shape of people's brains and tell anything about them. It's not really how it works. You can tell a little bit about the brain structure from the skull. No, you can. So I mean, they have in studies of human evolution, they have looked at the inside of hominid skulls, and they have said that, this one area that we know is associated with language acquisition and processing seems to be slightly larger. So maybe this ancient, millions of years ago human ancestor, was developing some sort of capacity for language. Yeah, that kind of thing we can speculate on. It's not for sure, we can speculate. But you certainly can't tell how secretive someone is by looking at their brain. That's just bonkers. Okay, so none of this is real. Measuring skulls, doesn't really tell you. You can sometimes you can have some idea about maybe where in the world this person came from cranial measurements, but it's pretty questionable. This, you definitely cannot tell anything about someone by the shape of their brain. It's all bananas stuff. But people believed in it, right? In the 17 and 1800s, this was cutting edge science, and people actually thought that A, race was a biological difference, that B, some races were biologically better than others, and C, you could actually read the inside of people's skulls and determine what their personality was like. And again, who do you think had the best personalities race-wise? Who do you think were the hardest working, most intelligent, most conscientious, most morally upstanding people? Yeah, white people were, right? Again, there's no reality to this. This is not connected to reality in any way, but that's what people thought they were seeing. Bonkers, right? So again, you'll still see stuff like this around. Had to do with phrenology. It is a pseudoscience. Pseudo meaning false. It is not scientific in any way. It's all bananas. So again, even though these ideas are not real, they become real, right? So people have a prejudice. People need a justification to colonize certain areas. Science gets involved and starts to find the kinds of answers that people want. It starts to get written into the law codes of a new nation, the US and Canada. And all of a sudden you have race as a socially meaningful thing. Something that biologically speaking makes no difference, but socially speaking and legally speaking winds up making a big difference for people. I'll show you a little more of that, but we're almost out of time. The thing I'll mention to you before I wrap it up here is that we will have our last, haha, you wish. We will have our third quiz on Friday, which I think I mentioned last week. There's Teams. So I just posted this in Teams. I think I have the classes. It'll cover class 21 to 33. It doesn't quite bring us to the end of sexism, but I think the end of sexism was class 36, and I don't want to do like 15 classes on one quiz. That's too much. So it won't cover all of sexism. It'll just cover a part of it. But there it is. And again, we'll do it the same way as we normally do. I'll do the online Microsoft Teams quizzes for the online people first, and then we'll do the written ones, so you'll get to sleep in a little bit on Friday if you so desire. Yeah. Other than that, I think that's all. I think that's all I have for. Oops. I think that's all I have for you today. So I will bid you adieu. Come back tomorrow. We'll finish these questions. I've got a little video for you to see. And then I forget what comes next. But more racism stuff. So that's all for today. Pack it up. I'll see you tomorrow, okay? All right. Yes.